Alright, Jake Paul, Nate Diaz wrapped up, and man, I was so worried going into this matchup that I could just take a sigh of relief that Nate Diaz did not get flatline KO, because if that happened, I don't think I would have been able to handle that. But not only did he not get flatline KO, but he actually did pretty decent. Like, I actually thought he was doing pretty well. I thought it was a very close fight. I don't know if that's a popular opinion, but a lot of the rounds themselves were close. Of course, you gotta give it to Jake. I don't think you could really debate that, but I do think that there is a case that you can give Nate Diaz like 3 or 4 rounds of this thing out of the 10. Personally, I gave him like 3 or 4. I don't really remember. I know I gave him round 2 and 4, and I believe 9. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that, but yeah, it was just an all-around entertaining fight and a lot of clinching. I think that helped with Nate, but I'm gonna get into why I think Nate did so well against Jake Paul, as well as why I think that Jake Paul is just gotten worse since the Tommy Fury fight. Like, I don't even know. Like, Jake Paul actually looked better in the Tyron Woodley fight than he did in this fight. He's regressed in skill, and I don't know, maybe this is just a lack of motivation. I mean, he's been doing this for what, now, like 4 years or so? You gotta wonder, you know, he has all that money. Is the motivation going? Does he really care? Or is that boxing gap, like, is he just not able to learn new stuff because he has been doing this for a long time? It's gonna take him now slower to learn new skills than it would have maybe when he first started boxing, because he didn't know so much, but now he knows a lot more, so it's hard to make those big improvements. But regardless, I do want to give credit to Jake. It was impressive, but I think that Nate, honestly, if he was in his prime, I think he would have beaten Jake Paul. Like, I think that Nate is just a lot slower. I don't think he was as motivated. We're gonna get into all that and more, but I just want to remind you guys, hit the subscribe button, like, comment, and share. We're trying to 20K by the end of the year, so it would just help me out with that if you guys could just, you know, chip in and help out with the goal as always. But I want to talk about the fight because I think this fight might have been really big. I think a lot of people were talking about it, and yeah, I mean, the story going into this was that Jake Paul was going to finish Nate Diaz. I didn't think that this was going to happen. Of course, I was scared. I did predict Jake by decision, if you guys will recall. I didn't think he was going to be able to finish him. I mean, he didn't finish Anderson Silva. I get it. He knocked him down. He also knocked down Nate Diaz, but I don't think that Jake has the knockout power that a lot of people make it out to be. I know a lot of you guys disagree. I've seen a few of you guys, you know, make your comments saying you disagree, but I still stand by what I said. I don't think he has a crazy knockout power. He has decent power. I mean, he's been training boxing. Of course, he's going to have good power, but does he have, you know, a kind of like Deontay Wilder type power, or power that's beyond someone like of average boxing ability? I'm not so sure about that. I mean, maybe he has a little bit more, but I don't think he has, you know, just dangerous power. I think KSI has more power than Jake Paul, right? So, you know, that's something to talk about, and it happened, and I think that Jake should have went to the body a lot more. I mean, especially early. I mean, he hurt Nate Diaz in that first round. I was like, not a first round finish. Like, I was sweating, just quiet watching that round, and a big sigh of relief happened after that round, because the second round, Nate Diaz comes back and wins the round, and I thought from there the fight was pretty close. I want to talk about some big moments. You know, obviously in round 5, Jake Paul knocks down Nate Diaz with a big left hook. Like, that was a wonderful left hook that landed on the temple of Nate Diaz, and I thought he might have been done from there, because, you know, I did see him, you know, he stumbled through the ropes, and typically when you see someone go under the ropes, I usually find that they call the fight there, but luckily the referee didn't call the fight there. Nate Diaz was able to get back up like nothing happened, as if he just tumbled, and yeah, and then he kept going forward at Jake, and I think a lot of people are going to hate on this and say, hey, it wasn't close. Like, a lot of boxing people might say it wasn't close. It was a pretty close fight. Like, Nate Diaz was holding his own in there, and I don't think that's a testament to how good Nate Diaz is, right? I think if Nate Diaz was in there against another regular pro that maybe is of lower level, like maybe a Tommy Fury, I think he does a lot worse, and I think maybe he gets finished. Like, I think if he fights Tommy Fury, Fury's going to just shut him down with that jab. I think just Nate Diaz will just accept losing a decision against Tommy Fury, but a very dominant one at that. Well, I think that Jake just made a lot of mistakes in this fight. I think he should have went to the body a lot more. His coach just kept telling him, hey, rip to the body, rip to the body. He kept working, but he kind of abandoned it past the first few rounds, and I felt like he got the knockdown because he started setting up shots to the body, making him think about the body. You know, it doesn't matter if you're Nate Diaz or whatever it is, like, you're gonna get knocked out by the shot you don't see coming, and it was good to just set it up to the body. So I think Jake Paul should have done a little bit more of that. I'm gonna get into what else I think Nate Diaz should have done, but I want to talk about Jake Paul at first. And another thing that really worries me is that I don't think that he really fixed the mistakes that he needs to fix in order to rematch Tommy Fury, right? Like, a lot of the problem with Jake Paul in that Tommy Fury fight was the fact that in combination, Fury was throwing at him, going forward, Jake Paul would pretty much just cover up, go backwards. I felt like that was a lot of Jake's problem. Like, Nate would just go forward. You know, Nate doesn't even have a lot of power, right? Like, he doesn't throw with so much power, more of volume. So I don't get why I couldn't have just, you know, tried to throw something in the pocket, but I think he kind of covers up, clinches, and tries to reset, right? Which works against Nate Diaz, but that's why it's not going to work against Tommy Fury. Fury's not going to let you reset, you know what I mean? And it just worries me for a Tommy Fury rematch. He called out Tommy Fury, he didn't call out KSI. I'm going to talk about what I think about that matchup. Yeah, and he wants to do Nate Diaz and MMA. I want to also talk about that, about Logan Paul, Nick Diaz and MMA, apparently. I'm going to talk about all of that. There's a lot to talk about, about. But first, I also want to talk about why I think Nate Diaz did so well, what I think that he did that was different from other MMA fighters, right? I think he did very good in the clinch. And guys, I don't know how many of you guys have actually like trained any clinch work or anything like that. That could be so exhausting and something that you're not used to as a boxer. And I thought that the referee actually let them in the clinch a decent amount of times. Like some referees will be like no clinching at all. I thought this guy did a decent amount, and I think that really tired out Jake. He wasn't expecting that kind of grueling fight, and Nate really brought that to him in that regard, and it's because of that jiu-jitsu background, that grappling background that he has. He was able to tire out Jake Paul, and I think that's why Jake Paul eventually was kind of holding on to Nate Diaz. I don't think he liked, Nate Diaz, fighting over position inside the clinch. Like, I think eventually he realized, hey, this is exhausting, and I think that's why we saw Jake Paul do so bad in this fight. Like, to be quite honest, this was one of the worst Jake Paul performances. I thought he was going to do a lot better. I thought we were going to see, like, Nate Diaz battered, but I didn't think he was going to get knocked out. I thought he was going to get battered. Didn't happen that way, and it was a pretty close fight. And yeah, so I thought Nate did a good job of that. At one point, he had a standing guillotine over Jake Paul. I was like, oh my god, is he just not going to let this go? That would have been a legendary moment, but he did, of course. And yeah, it was overall a really good fight. Nate Diaz had a lot of funny moments, obviously doing his classic Nate Diaz type thing. And all in all, I thought it was a really good performance from Nate Diaz. Did a lot better than I think a lot of people expected, but I think we all expected Jake to do a little bit better, which begs to differ, how is he going to do in these future matchups with a potential Tommy Fury rematch or KSI rematch? I'm going to talk about that, but first I want to bring up this whole news. Nate Diaz came onto the DAZN broadcast afterwards saying he would be down to fight either Paul brother, and even calls out Logan Paul, and I think that this would be crazy, but I think it is a possibility. Logan Paul has been saying, hey, I want to do MMA. He's been saying this for years, even before I think he fought KSI in that rematch. He said 1000% he's going to do MMA at some point. Could we see Nate Diaz versus Jake Paul in MMA, but maybe as a co-main event we see Logan Paul versus Nick Diaz? That fight would sell a lot of pay-per-views. Like, everybody's going to want to see it. I don't want to see that fight because Nick Diaz did not look so good in that Robbie Lawler fight, but obviously there's a big difference between Logan Paul and Robbie Lawler, but Logan Paul's also a really big guy. He's been training a lot of wrestling. But will he want to go to the wrestling with Nick Diaz because he does have really good jiu-jitsu? I don't know. It's a lot of questions. And also another thing is obviously Logan Paul is partnered with the UFC with the Prime Hydration, so I don't know how that's going to affect things because I assume that Jake Paul has to do that in the PFL. So could he go over, to the PFL without pissing off some people at the UFC? It seems that Logan Paul has always said, hey, I want to do something in the UFC, so maybe he wouldn't do something in the PFL. I don't know. It's tough to say, but either way, I think that would sell a lot of pay-per-views, and that's a big opportunity, Really good for the PFL if they manage to get that fight, right? But I don't know if it's so good because I don't think a lot of people are going to be sticking around for the PFL. I think it'll just be that, one event that does well, but still, I want to talk about Jake Paul, future Jake Paul, future Nate Diaz. I want to start with Nate Diaz, of course, the MMA guy. I hope he goes back to the UFC. I think that this was a perfect kind of scenario. It was a close fight with Jake Paul. Kind of won the war, not the battle, so to speak. As always, Nate Diaz does. I mean, he kind of looked better than Jake Paul did in this fight, if we're going to be honest. Like, in terms of what, social media is saying, I think more people are holding Nate to a higher regard than they are to Jake, which you could say is unfair because Jake did win the fight, but that's just how Nate Diaz works. He doesn't have to win to win. So I think he should just go back to the UFC. Maybe they try to make that Conor McGregor trilogy fight, maybe for UFC 300, depending on when McGregor's going to fight Chandler, or if he even does. I don't know. They could probably make some sort of trilogy with them at some point, and it will do amazing numbers. Maybe they do it at 302, just 100 pay-per-views later after their original rematch. And I don't know what the likelihood of Nate Diaz coming back to the UFC after fighting at the PFL. Who knows, though? Nate Diaz is a big money guy, and, the UFC isn't going to say no to a lot of pay-per-views. So I think the move is for Nate Diaz to say, fuck this MMA shit. Let me fight in the UFC. And for Jake Paul, I mean, there's a lot of interesting matchups, but I think there's one, regardless of what's going to happen in October, I think the fight to make is KSI versus Jake Paul. I think KSI is going to lose to Tommy Fury. Tommy Fury will have beaten both of them. I say let's make that matchup, and the winner fights Tommy Fury in a rematch. I don't know if KSI would be interested in fighting Tommy Fury in a rematch, depending on how the fight goes. Regardless, I think that they should make KSI versus Jake Paul. Now, it's going to really be up to Jake Paul, because if Tommy Fury does beat KSI, Tommy Fury will be able to fight Jake Paul, and he's going to choose to fight Jake Paul. So it's really going to be up to Jake Paul to say, hey, I want to fight KSI first, which it didn't really seem like that's on his mind. He didn't call out KSI at all. I feel like now is the perfect time to make the fight. The perfect thing happened where KSI fought better opponents and Jake has lost. Now it's kind of even the playing field a little bit, that now it kind of seems like that matchup is pretty close. Who do I think wins that one, guys? I honestly don't know, because he looked really bad in this fight, but so is KSI. KSI is not exactly the best either, so I don't know, honestly. I don't know. It's a tough one. It really depends on the game plan of each fighter, but I just don't know how well this new team is doing Jake. We didn't see Shane Mosley in the corner. I assume that might be because of the problems with Dylan Dennis, where apparently Shane Mosley had told Dylan Dennis some information about Jake Paul about a couple years ago, basically saying that he wanted to train Dylan Dennis to fight Jake Paul because he was mad at Jake Paul for something that he did. So that's an interesting storyline as well, but he wasn't in the corner. I think it was because of that reason. Jake said the DMs were fake, but apparently it seems like it is. So anyway, guys, yeah, that was Nate Diaz versus Jake Paul. What a fight. What a boxing fight. And yeah, guys, I'm going to make a video about Corey Sandhagen versus Rob Font very soon, so tune in for that video. I'll probably be out later tonight, and we'll review, because that was a controversial fight in terms terms of if it was boring or not, I'll talk about it there. Guys, you guys are the best fan base in MMA and boxing and YouTube boxing and combat sports in general. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.